Hello, and welcome to the Slow Ready Podcast, a casual conversation about all things Goose. I'm Mike.
And I'm Alex.
We have a lot more fun topics planned for future episodes, so be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcast and follow us on all the socials: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook at Slow Ready Pod. Today's episode, we thought it would be a nice idea to go ahead and do kind of a brief history of our favorite band, Goose, here. And just as kind of a caveat, we don't think that we can cover absolutely everything under the sun when it comes to Goose. So we're not going to try to, but we are going to try and give you some of the highlights. And also worth noting, we do acknowledge that there are a ton of articles out there, and trying to cobble all of this together. Can't confirm everything is 100% accurate, but to the best of our knowledge, this is the best information that they have out there. So, kind of just to get us started, I think probably the most natural starting point would be to kind of go back to the beginning when Rick Materatonda meets Matt Campbell, which they originally met while Matt was in college and Rick was still in high school. And then they met again at a jam party at Trevor's house with a bunch of people participating. So that kind of becomes the beginning of Vasudo back in 2012. So, yeah, what do you think, Alex? Maybe start here?
Yeah, that's probably the best place to start without diving too deep into these guys' high school bands history and stuff like that. Like you mentioned, Rick and Matt met through mutual friends in their local community, and there was eventually a jam party at Trevor Weeks' house, the bassist for Goose, where they really hit it off, and they walked back over to Matt's house to grab his keys and went back to Trevor's to jam out for a while. They really hit it off after that and started performing covers locally on the scene, and later eventually recruited Trevor in to join the band along with Jeff, who is now in the band Goose, but wasn't fully in the band to get things started.
Absolutely. And I did think it was a funny note that when Matt and Rick started performing together, they started out as the Pink Flamingos, which absolutely terrific name. Also, got to admit that I'm a little bit jealous that apparently in Connecticut, it's perfectly normal to have jam parties in high school and college. I missed out on that.
Yeah, seriously.
Could not be so lucky. I do think it's interesting though, like this early on, we're just kind of like at the beginning of a pseudo starting out well before anything like Goose is starting. And they already had such great songs written. Like, it was clear that they were just all very talented songwriters. Cause I mean, you're talking about some of the first originals: Hot Tea, Butter Rum, Empress of Organos, Factory Fiction, and the recently resurgent Hot Love and the Lazy Poet, which was everybody's favorite opener of summer. So I just think it's pretty incredible that Mac and Rick were just able to do this kind of right from the very beginning as young guys.
Yeah, they just had instant chemistry, it seems, and it's pretty wild when you look through some of the records and articles we're going to cite in our show doc that Hot Love was apparently the first Vasudo song that they officially put together as an official track, and it didn't resurface as a Goose song until this year in 2024, which is nuts. Eventually, they wound up recording an EP together that they probably cobbled together as a first effort called The French Tapes, and debuted it in 2013, and it only had 50 copies, so whoever's got that thing is a lucky goose. I was going to say duck, but I'll say goose. And yeah, it's just wild to think that they were putting out songs, like you mentioned, so early into their musical careers.
Yeah. And you want to talk about the high end of Goose collecting. I imagine the 50 copies, anyone has one of those. I mean, forget about what you thought about Hard Times getting a vinyl for Goose. That's got to be the holy grail right there. And then sadly, right after they put out their EP the same year, they have their last performance. So kind of a little bit bittersweet, because obviously a band with a lot of talent and a lot of promise, it kind of almost like it ends before it really gets going. So kind of right after the Vasudo period, Rick leaves Berkeley and then moves to Colorado for a year. But when he comes back in fall of 2014, he re-enrolls at Berkeley and then starts Goose. So much happened in a year there. We go from probably the excitement of dropping their first EP to that band is ending, and now Rick's gone across the country for a year and come back probably more inspired, and we got a whole new band, which is kind of leading us into the beginning of Goose here.
Yeah, and shout out to the El Goose Times. It's an awesome publication that gets put together during major milestones in the band's recent history, especially. And they try to put out an issue during big tour seasons and stuff like that. They had a cool interview with dear friend of the band, Coach, aka John Lombardi, and he had mentioned that he was in Trevor's ear during this kind of turbulent time, that he wasn't sure what he was going to do with his musical career. He was almost ready to hang it up, it sounded like, and Coach kind of talked him through it and said, "Hey, I have faith in you. I will put everything I can into helping you guys out." And it motivated Trevor to stay with it, and that led to the formation of Goose eventually, which is awesome. So thanks, Coach.
Big thanks to Coach. Absolutely. Coming through in the clutch there for us. So then Goose has started now. We're in 2014. Rick's back. He's back at Berkeley. We're starting Goose. And then they have 6 early shows in 2014. We're starting to get some new songs, some songs that we didn't hear with Vasudo. So we're starting to get Matavan, Jive One, Arcadia, Turn Clouds. They're also doing lots of covers for stuff like Schofield and the Dead, people that, have been a big part of Rick's musical development for sure. And it also includes the first Goose Miss, which before we started doing this, I was actually kind of shocked to learn that their very first year as a band was also the first year of Goose Miss. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and it's well worth noting that when Rick came back in 2014, he linked up with Trevor to get Goose started, and also with fellow Berkeley alum Ben Atkind on the drums. So they were the triumvirate that really started this thing. And they had their first Goose Miss, as you mentioned, in December of that year, down in Factory Underground in their local home state. And there's a little blurb from El Goose, awesome website, love those guys, that says, "The legendary inaugural Goose Miss event, John brought dozens of pizzas, trays of tenders, salad, and more, and maybe 10 or 12 kegs. Bonnie and a good friend held down the bar. Thresher, Gallardi, and others helped Coach set up in the basement of the studio. Goose played 3 sets, and the rest is history." Sounds awesome. Sounds like the best house party kind of vibe you could get, but it's a concert.
Absolutely. Big shout out to El Goose. That's probably a website that I'm on every single day of my life. So love those guys. That is maybe my favorite thing that I've read on that website. When you read it, I just don't know how you don't smile ear to ear because that sounds like a great party.
Yeah, another thing worth noting real quick was Goose is really, really well versed in playing covers, and fans know that they're going to get some cool covers. But at this show, they debuted 9 new covers at the time, which is wild. Lots of Christmas stuff, of course. You got like Linus and Lucy, and you got some Dead covers, you got some Schofield, you got Bob Marley, you got it all. Stevie Wonder. So I wish that I could easily go back and listen to this show. I would love to hear the earliest forms of Goose, but reading through the set list is awesome.
Absolutely. It's fun to dream and wish we were there. But also worth noting, you mentioned that it was Rick, Trevor, and Ben starting out with Goose. My understanding, there was kind of a rotation, and him and Jeff both took different turns playing drums at different periods for Visudo, even though that band was just together for a year or two. It sounds like there was a bit of a rotation. So it's interesting that what ended up both becoming members of Goose were both involved with Visudo as well.
It's pretty nuts that they found each other just through networking, and whether it was through school or just being from the same high school and local. It's pretty wild that they're all just able to be in the same place at the same time to make incredible music.
Yeah, I guess those Berkeley and Connecticut ties run deep.
I'd love to network over there.
So yeah, then we get to 2015 because, like I said, there's only 6 shows that we could see at least from 2014. Show list goes up quite a bit. Now they're doing 30 shows in that year. It's all in Connecticut still, so we haven't really branched out around the country or anything like that. But a significant increase in shows. Repeat of Goosemas at the Factory Underground again. They've also got a lot more new songs in the set list moving around. So it's starting to lay the groundwork for Moon Cabin. So you're starting to hear more of the songs from that, what would end up becoming that album. And then, right after that, Moon Cabin comes out in 2016. So they start really laying the groundwork heavy and very early on in this band's history to kind of set them up to go to the next level, is my feeling here.
Moon Cabin was a monumental point in time for these guys. I have to imagine they don't necessarily dub it as an official studio album for them, but it was really in my opinion, it is a studio album, and it's a really great effort for a first full effort by a band. a lot of these songs were, written and tinkered with by Rick at his mom's house on her third floor and little soundproofed room where there's interviews with her where she talks about how she could still hear through all the soundproofing and stuff and give feedback and all that. It seems like a really cool time to have been following them if you were local in Connecticut. Worth noting is this was before Peter Onspach joined the band in 2017, so they had some friends joining them on the keys, Chris Enright on the keys, and then they had another friend, Peter Castaldi, on the rhythm guitar on this album. They're not with the band, but we appreciate their contributions. And, they made a lot of connections during this time that would pop up later, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit more when we get into their future albums and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's also worth noting that the songs obviously on Moon Cabin are really good. I've heard varying opinions about how good the album may be in some people's eyes, but I don't think you can argue really too much about the songwriting craft because it's totally there and it's one of the more impressive first efforts I've seen out of a band. And I think the more you read about Rick, the more you realize like this guy has been a complete songwriter since he was in middle school. That's when his mom says that he's starting to already 8-track record in his basement. He's already writing complete works from start to finish on his own. I think you can definitely notice that being, starting out songwriting at such a young age, it definitely pays dividends early on in their career. Because I don't think if he had, I don't think Moon Cabin, the songwriting would have nearly as much polish as it does.
No, for sure. And to think there was that much untapped potential when Rick was in middle school that eventually was honed by learning music theory and going to lessons and things like that. And then you get Moon Cabin just a few years later, or maybe a little bit more than a few years, but still you get that out of just a guy messing with his guitar and writing some songs as an early teenager. It's incredible when you think about it.
Totally agree. So then after Moon Cabin, you start to see how that plays in with the ecosystem of the band because the next year, 2017, it's a humongous increase in shows, mostly still in the Northeast, but they're doing more states now. They're doing larger venues like the Brooklyn Bowl and they're making trips to the Southeast. So 2017 was a big level up year, I think is probably the best way to describe it, and really starting to bear the fruits of the labor that Moon Cabin was. So
Yeah, the band just kept adding a ton of shows. They started to get to that breakneck pace that they have on their tours that you see now. And they were taking a gig wherever they could get it, it seemed. There's not tons of information on their set list at the time. Those weren't necessarily released after every show and stuff like that, and they weren't putting out recordings like they do now. But when you look at all the gigs they did, it's pretty incredible. And you see that they were taking opening gigs for bands like RAQ and Annie in the Water and Strange Machines at the time. And also they were adding event type shows, for instance, they played their first New Year's Eve show that you can find that's been on record that year. Just a one set performance, but still notable. And they had a big Goose miss that year, which we can definitely dive into because it's a monumental point for this band.
absolutely. And not sure if you want to dive into this as well, but just something else major that happened to the band in 2017 was our boy Peter Ansbach finally joins. So can't understate that.
No, that's a huge addition. Peter adds so much to the band. He multi instrumentalist for the band, playing the keys, guitar, and singing on a lot of songs. And what's interesting about this was Peter wasn't a keys player when he was asked to join the band by Rick. He just was playing with his band, Great Blue, playing the guitar and singing. And he and Rick had gone to the same high school, albeit different times, but Rick really saw something in Peter and asked if he was willing to join the band and willing to learn the keys because he just saw something in Peter that has really panned out. And that's pretty wild when you think about it, that a guy like Peter had only practiced the keys for a few weeks and then jumped on stage for Goosemas with these guys and played the songs he knew, and now has really leveled up his keys playing.
Totally agree. I find myself saying all the time that every single tour you notice Peter level up again. He just keeps getting better every single tour. And I think it's really so interesting that Rick's talking about, at least the interviews for about that time, that he knows something's missing from the band, even though they're starting to experience success and he just can't put his finger on what it is. And then finally he's on his mom's exercise bike and it dawns on him that he needs Peter to join the band and that's what needs to happen. So it's kind of awesome that Rick just has like a prophetic vision that in order for the band to get to the next step, I need this guy to join. And it sounds like a lot of it was just because he saw how much fun Peter was having with music and he wanted that fun to be in the band. So obviously a crucial and huge turning point for them.
Yeah, and that's where you start to see some of the, I don't want to say less serious songs, but less serious types of songs, fun, like you mentioned, songs start creeping into the lineup. The more Peter got comfortable, a lot of these were songs from his band Great Blue that was touring around and still does. But Peter's frontman gig with Great Blue was really what inspired him to join. And yeah, you could start seeing a lot of the fun, dancey vibes creeping in more and more to the band.
And also, he kind of, I mean, this is a little bit further down the road, but he eventually kind of settles into the role of like de facto frontman. So you kind of definitely get the impression from all the tons of interviews that we were both pouring over this week that Rick didn't really have much interest in faking a frontman personality. And this kind of frees him up to focus on the music. And Peter fits so well into that role of being the face to the and voice to the audience. Kind of a match made in heaven.
Yeah, you got introvert life, Rick. Love that he's representing us introverts. I don't know why both of us as introverts decided to start a podcast, but maybe that was inspiration from Rick.
We're going to say it was.
Yeah, all credit to Rick.
So you mentioned that Goose Miss. Did you want to dive into that a little bit?
That set list, yeah. Let me pull it up here real quick. It's a short set from what I can see.
And obviously, things are harder to find from that era for sure.
Yeah, all it shows is 3 songs. Christmas Wrapping, Circle of Life, and Achy Breaky Heart on El Goose right now. So all covers, but it's pretty remarkable that Peter would be willing to get up on stage and join a band playing the keys after only a few weeks of practice.
Absolutely insane. Don't know how many musicians would have the courage to just, yeah, sure, I'll teach myself piano and I'll be ready. We've also gotten very spoiled as Goose fans because we have set list and video and audio the next day after every show. So we've come a long way in the Goose community for sure.
It's it's pretty wild when you think about a band this modern and this young and how tough it is still to find stuff from the early days when you see so much documenting going around on the internet these days. That just shows you how small they were at the time and how kind of tight-lipped and close they were with their community, and they don't really have a lot out there for a lot of their set lists and stuff like that until they start blowing up getting into 2018, which we can dive into now.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like there was a fairly big Connecticut bubble that had to be punctured before we could kind of move on to the next stage. But in 2018, it's kind of continuing a similar trend here with 2017 in that you're getting a lot more shows, you're still getting larger venues, but starting to make it further across the country. We're hitting Ohio now, we're hitting Colorado, more trips to the Southeast. There's quite a few show highlights from that year as well as they're developing continuously.
Yeah, so Peter's still getting acclimated with the band. They kicked off the year opening gigs for Spafford, which at the time was huge, and everyone thought Spafford was going to be kind of where Goose is now.
Totally.
Huge opportunity for Goose. And Peter just continued gaining confidence, and they were introducing the first known versions of a lot of songs like Elizabeth and Butter Rum and Doc Brown. And Echo of a Rose officially came out after that basement gig with Fasudo that we talked about earlier. Finally came out at a Goose show. And as they were continuing to build momentum from that Spafford tour and otherwise, they also had some headlining gigs of their own. They were selling gigs out that they were headlining. And the first 2-night stand that this band had in their history was outside of Connecticut, pretty remarkably. It was in Covington, Kentucky at the Octave. Pretty crazy. They had just managed to develop such a big following that you will see in that general Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky area as the years go on. And yeah, it was a pretty sick 2-night run. They played a lot of rarities during those shows and eventually continued that momentum. They played what they called a Netflix and Chill show that year. They introduced that series of shows that they've kind of since stopped calling it that, but it was a series of shows where the band would pick a movie and have a whole show themed around that night, whether it was costumes or just references thrown in. And the first show was on July 5th of 2018, and it was Caddyshack themed, which is Awesome.
So on brand.
It's totally on brand for these guys, and you can see it in their humor from these shows that they picked movie themes from. You can kind of see where some of the humor comes from. Then they followed it up with a second one, Austin Powers themed, and then kind of wrapped up their Netflix and Chill series for 2018 with two Halloween shows on October 27th and 28th, and those were Goosebuster themed. Lots of Ghostbuster references throughout. They played the theme song and all of that in the shows, and pretty exciting time to be a part of the band and start to see their culture really develop, and the humor really prevailed when you look at these shows, and you can see how their social media and their marketing is tied around their humor in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. Just 2 points to highlight there as well. As far as the Ghostbusters theme, I'm sure a lot of us enjoyed the documentary from Wilton High this earlier this year because it includes a video of Rick performing on 420 in high school, the Ghostbusters song. So that line of humor goes back a long ways, obviously. And another note about that two-night stand at the Octave in Kentucky, those are actually the first two shows that Andrew Getty is a member or the actual official lighting director of Goose. So those that are in the know and have been following Goose for a little while, you obviously understand you cannot overstate how important what Andrew Getty does, how he makes this band look so great on a nightly basis with the creative ways he uses his lighting rigs. So obviously those shows in Kentucky are super significant for a multitude of reasons.
The Sixth Man, baby. Love Getty.
Absolutely. He's one of the best. Do you have anything else there on 2018, Alex?
No, once again, they're still diving into their releasing of set lists and stats and things like that. You definitely get a lot more of that. Obviously, they had their Goosemas that year, another great performance. I could not find a theme for that year, as you can find for some of their more recent years. They would theme the Goosemasses, but no, really, they really leveled up, like you said, in the summertime, and some of those fun themed shows were really where I started to see the culture permeate with this band. So on to 2019, I think.
So 2019 is, I think most people familiar with Goose, at least a little bit, are going to have heard one time or another that 2019 was the breakout year. It was. So many things happening in 2019, large increase in shows. I'll probably get tired of myself saying that because it's just every year more shows, better shows. A lot more festivals this year. Tumble appears in January for the first time. Fall tour, first one where they sold advance tickets. And Peach Fest, I'm sure we're going to absolutely talk about that. How can you not if you're a Goose fan? Peach Fest definitely matters. And a big Goose miss in 2019 as well. So, where do you want to start, Alex?
Say, let's dive in a little bit. So, you had mentioned that they really leveled up with their gigs. Most of these were headlining gigs, which is pretty remarkable for a band this young. And they really were focused on increasing their exposure with all these festival gigs. So, you had them showing up at places like Revival Music Festival, Summer Camp Music Festival, Beanstalk Music and Mountain Festival, Paradise Music and Beer Fest. And then there's even more. I didn't want to list them all out because I will bore you guys. But a lot of festivals, maybe on the smaller side of things, but they really blew up when they made their appearance at Peach Music Festival, as you mentioned, which is truly where I started first hearing about this band through friends. And I was like, oh, they're just talking about some band that played the early set at a festival, whatever. But you go back and you listen to this set, and they just blew the doors off the place. They were playing one of the side stages at the event, the Grove stage, and they had an early slot, played about an hour and a half. And it looks like if you watch the show, you can see the crowd growing as they're playing, maybe from the main stage or whatever, and coming over to hear this crowd going nuts and this band just blowing the doors off of Scranton.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such a good recording. It's legendary at this point, and that's really not even exaggerating. But if you watch the video of it, I feel like it's even easier to see why that was the moment that caught everyone because if you were there in person, I mean, the atmosphere is just absolutely insane. And I every time I watch the video, I go, if you were at this show, I don't see how you leave without becoming a fan that day because it's just they caught lightning in a bottle that day. It's just fantastic start to finish.
Yeah, and the peak of that for sure has to be that Arcadia that they've recognized and have released, whether it's via video or on the Alive and Well recording. And you just really hear the full scale of the whole band's dynamic in just that one song. But if you watch the whole set, you can see the momentum building up to that point, which is mid set during that show. And it just never stops from that point. Absolutely killer. They have the full thing on YouTube for you to watch on the Goose official channel, I believe, and definitely worth a watch if you've only listened to a snippet of a song or two from that or anything like that. The whole thing is still an awesome performance that holds up to this day.
Yeah, Arcadia definitely is the crown jewel, like you said, and I think that's been the song that was the convincer for a lot of people to get into this band and start getting serious about it. And I do think it's also really neat that this band has a great self awareness about them. Not every band does, but they all kind of always point back to that show as being so pivotal because they realize that's when it kind of started snowballing for them. So yeah, I've watched Peach Fest. I've lost count of how many times, but it's never going to be something that gets old or that I stop watching it. It's must see viewing for sure.
No, it's one of those points in time that's going to continue to be pointed back to even as we amend this history of Goose as the years go on. It's still going to be one of those points that is everlasting and stays in their history forever, I think.
Yep, 100% agree.
And then you mentioned their 2019 fall tour. That was an awesome time to be a fan, I imagine, post Peach Fest hype. They were really building off of that success, and they were experimenting a ton after that, just trying some unreal stuff, whether it's through covers or the order of their set lists. And this is really when a lot of their shows started being recorded, and you could get copies of the soundboard recordings that are on Nugs now. And I have to imagine being a fan at that time was remarkable, but for the band, you could almost hear their confidence permeating through after all the acclaim they got from that Peach Fest show, eventually leading to them selling those fall tour tickets and really becoming the success story they are now. This is really the start, in my opinion, of the big time touring and shows.
Yeah, totally. And Peter's thoughts on this are pretty interesting to read too, because you can almost tell by the way he phrases things that they weren't expecting to sell advance tickets and sell out on that fall tour. So at that time, they kind of didn't even really notice the kind of bump that they were getting from Peach Fest. So I'm sure that had to feel absolutely amazing. And this is definitely where also, like you mentioned, Nugs, if you're, a Nugs subscriber, which I fully endorse and recommend anyone that's following Goose should get on Nugs. You start to get a lot more selection here. You can actually kind of revisit this part of Goose's history a little bit more in detail and more intimately. So 2019, really cool area if you're just kind of getting into Goose. Definitely wouldn't have any problem recommending those shows from 2019 as a good starting point to jump in.
No, for sure. And especially that fall run is there's really not a bad show in the mix there. There's tons to look at in terms of the new covers they were trying out, the way they were experimenting with where they would slot songs in their set lists. You're not going to get bored listening to anything from that time. Circling back just a tiny bit, they had another Netflix and chill show that year, semi-pro theme this time. I played it on Halloween proper at the Mercury Lounge in New York City. So outside of their bubble of Connecticut this time, but sounds awesome. They were playing covers like "Love Me Sexy" by Jackie Moon and "Why Can't We Be Friends" by War during that show. And so they were throwing in new covers that they're kind of fun and funny at the same time. And I have to imagine being semi-pro themed, they were pretty light and fun on stage that night.
I can only imagine how much fun that would have been. Love Me Sexy is definitely now going on my wish list.
I need to look at the history of that song, but I'm not sure how much it's in the rotation if it is anymore. But that's pretty awesome. Whoever was there for that.
Yeah, probably not in the rotation, but A Guy Can Dream. That would be epic.
And during that fall tour, they had their official release of a show eventually from that tour from Buffalo, New York, at the venue called Nietzsche's, I believe. I can't pronounce that. It's spelled really funny. On November 16th of that year. That eventually got released as a vinyl as well, which for the collectors out there, that's a pretty tough one to get now too, I imagine. But as I was saying before, there really isn't a bad show in this mix. That just because they officially released that one doesn't make it necessarily the best one for me. It's a killer show. It's what I introduced myself to this band with, but you can't go wrong. Even the show the night before from Columbus is one that I've listened to a ton.
Totally agree there. The Buffalo show has definitely been in heavy rotation ever since I became a fan. Huge fan of that show. Columbus is also very good. And as we went through this week, I found myself going back to Nugs and going to the 2019 and 2018 shows a little bit here and there. And It's so ridiculous how Peter is like a year or two into playing keyboard, and these shows are already like just becoming amazing levels. And where they're at now, it's obviously impressive how much he keeps leveling up. But even back then, you're like, these shows are really kind of just mind blowing for someone that's this new at keys. Like he's killing it.
Yeah, and the pace that they were introducing new songs and new covers is pretty remarkable, especially when you're throwing jams in and stuff like that with a guy like Peter, who's not as familiar with the keys as he is with the guitar, is insane. It's a testament to their musical talent on stage there, and I don't know how you have the guts to get up on stage and play keys when it's so new with a band that's growing this fast. So all the props in the world to Peter. We love that guy.
Beat side, sweet side.
Another highlight, real quick, from that fall leg was they played a show on December 14th in Indianapolis. It was one of their first big sellout shows that I could find, and it's got a lot of killer versions of songs and covers that are heavy in the rotation even still. Great Madhuvan from that show, in my opinion. So definitely check that out. Which leads into Goosemas. Goosemas 6 back in Norwalk, Connecticut. And wow, was this a barn burner of a show. I just recently listened back to that, and it's awesome. Have you had a chance to listen to this recently, Mike?
Not recently. I'm gonna be listening to it tonight though, now that you're catching me off guard, because now I gotta pull up this set list.
Well, this was one of the first Goosemas shows where I could find a theme documented, thanks to the guys at El Goose again. The first set of this show was called The Ghost of Goosemas Past, and the second set was The Ghost of Goosemas Future. So feeling that Christmas story vibe that night. They had a couple openers that night as well, and tons of Christmas covers. Just one of the most awesome highlights from that show, in my opinion, is from the first set where the band played a really great version of All I Need, went right into Carol of the Bells, just sick, and then wrapped up that set with Linus and Lucy, which is always a treat. And then they just continued on in the second set, a little bit less of the Christmas covers, but just jams and jams and jams. And they finished the set off. They had done a raffle that night for a canned food drive that they had organized, and Peter was reading off the winners, and the band was jamming behind him, which is pretty cool to listen to when you listen back at just how loose and unscripted a lot of things were during this time.
Absolutely. And just to kind of issue a clarification here, I did listen to this about a month ago, but in Goose Land and in my head, that's not really recent. So there's been a lot of shows I've listened to in that time period. But yeah, I do remember listening to this actually about a month ago, randomly enough. And this is a really terrific show. And these covers are face melting, I guess is the only way I can put it.
Oh, yeah. This is one of those bands where I'm not disappointed personally if I see a set list with a lot of covers, because I know they'll do them justice 99.99% of the time.
They are the greatest cover band in existence, and I will accept no other opinions on this topic.
Fair enough. I'm not going to argue with that.
So, ready to move into 2020?
Yeah, let's move into 2020. I think that's a good segue.
So, 2020 is obviously kind of interesting, not just for Goose, for all of us, obviously. But I think if you were trying to look for the relatively small examples of success in such a challenging year, Goose would probably be at or near the top of the list, you'd have to say, because I don't know that anyone could dream of executing a year where you're not touring like for real better than they did. They were so creative in dealing with the pandemic and time off of the road that instead of losing momentum or having to start over in 2021, it seemed like they were pretty much ahead of most of the bands in the jam band scene. And just some of the things that they did, of course, the bingo tour was humongous. Goosemas Remote, they did Playing in the Sand in Mexico in 2020. So, and Jeff joins the band full time, hasn't been with Rick since the Vasudo days. So much happens during this COVID period when a lot of people had pushed the brakes. So where do you want to start, Alex?
A lot to get into, and we're talking about the momentum they had from 2019. They were carrying that into 2020. So it's really a shame that the COVID pandemic looked like it was going to put a halt to that, and the band just navigated it perfectly. So they kicked it off, continuing the semi-festival circuit type of deal with Playing in the Sand. They played 3 gigs technically at that. They played a secret opening set on January 14th for like a pre-party for the people who arrived early for Playing in the Sand. That got cut a little short because of the weather, but still awesome if you were there. And then they played 2 sets on the 17th and 18th of January that year before we all had to worry about COVID, playing in front of crowds, getting exposure, getting those dead fans on board, I imagine. And then later in January, they had actually recorded the first official recording of Arabelo with Jeff for an Osiris podcast that they were guesting on. And that wasn't released till later, but it's almost poetic as we get into the COVID times that they had done this, because a lot of Arabelo gigs, I think at the time maybe they hadn't decided on a acoustic trio yet at that time, but at the time they hadn't settled on the name Arabelo yet. And this got released eventually during COVID times, and people were like thinking that it was recorded during that, but it was actually months before we'd all really gotten worried about it. And like you said, the band navigated all this super well. So going into March, they were gigging pretty heavily. They were playing all kinds of shows up to the wire into early March, and then had to just start canceling gigs with everything shutting down for COVID. And they pivoted so quick. They did a stream they called Live from T's House on March 15th. Literally the week everything shut down, I feel like. And they really set the bar with the camera work and the quality of their feeds and their audio and everything on how bands should navigate COVID with virtual shows.
1,000%. Yeah. If you were anything like I'm sure me and Alex were at that time, it was absolutely killing you to be stuck indoors. You should be gearing up for summer concert season, but it's not coming. And they just found a way to go above and beyond what anyone else was doing at the time. I mean, that bingo tour was maybe one of the most creative things I've ever seen a band do. And for those who haven't seen it or aren't familiar, they were essentially, they would have these bingo balls that would come up and it would be like 20-minute jam. And they would just have to go into a 20-minute jam, or it'd be like take a lap, and they'd have to actually like do exercise like while they're performing a show. And the amount of outreach and new eyeballs they were able to get on themselves when a lot of people felt like they were losing a lot of momentum or time that they could be, out with their band. Goose just kind of went the other way and was like, no, we'll find a way to make this work to our advantage. And fortunately, they're so gifted at, using social media, the internet, whatever tools they have available to them to kind of make the best of a crappy situation. And I mean, I don't think it's a surprise. That's the first time that I got ears and eyeballs on them. A lot of it was because of how much great content they were putting out in a year when people weren't releasing a whole lot.
Man, I wish I was listening to Goose back then. I missed out on this. I've gone back and watched it, and it still has that magic to it, but that's with the context of knowing what it felt like in COVID. I can't imagine what it felt like at that time, how personal that must have felt, that they were putting all this effort into putting on great shows and great ideas for people who were stuck at home, missing their loved ones. And it felt probably like a warm hug from the band. Those bingo shows are awesome. There's an official movie that you can still get on Amazon, I believe, that kind of covers a little bit of that, and it's one of their shows from bingo, and you get a sense of some of the humor and stuff thrown in there too. There's some funny bits, especially at the set break and stuff like that, of just the kind of dry humor that these guys love. And yeah, you had mentioned the bingo balls. Just imagine just having go into an old school bingo spot, and they had the balls in the little trapper, and they were picking out songs and different caveats like the 20-minute jams and doing push-ups and taking laps and stuff like that, just purely based off random. They put together 4 shows during the summer like that, and then they actually played a 5th show just kind of in a sheep pasture that's unplugged-ish, and it's pretty interesting to listen back to. So definitely check those out if you haven't. There's also an official Bingo Tour album release that you can pick up. I believe it's tied to the video release that I had mentioned, but definitely worth checking out. Some great recordings. And circling back just a tiny bit, that acoustic trio, aka Arabelo, was also doing their own streams early on during COVID, because Jeff, Rick, and Peter were all roommates and there was nowhere to go. So they were just jamming out in their apartment or whatever, putting on live streams for us to listen to through April and May. Pretty killer time to be a fan when you're stuck at home and these guys are just pumping out content and new stuff for you to listen to.
Absolutely. And maybe if like some people out there are not as familiar, Rebelo's kind of like the acoustic version of Goose. So they've got an album out now that they just released, and it definitely stands on its own feet as well. And I will second as well with those bingo songs. They have the movies, but they also have the tracks, like Alex was saying. And some of those tracks are still in my playlist to this day. The Creatures is really good. The Drive is really good. So definitely a lot of gems back there to go back and listen to if you haven't had the chance, for sure.
Yeah. And with all of that success and all the new viewers they were getting from Bingo Tour and their live streams and stuff, they eventually were also pioneering some of these drive-in and socially distanced shows that you were starting to see later in 2020. They had a couple of shows, socially distanced type of events in Cape Cod and in Morris, Connecticut, and in Vermont. And it's pretty crazy that you saw them as one of the first big ish gigs doing that and bringing in crowds that were filling these venues as full as they could be in the social distance time, when you're in a drive in situation in your car in your little bubble. One of these socially distanced shows was going to be what I believe is the final official Knit Flocks and Chill show. I keep bringing it up because I love that they would do these theme shows, and it was supposed to be on Halloween and actually got snowed out, so they had to delay. They had to delay the thing a week, and they wound up going with Donnie Darko. And each of the band members, you can find pictures of this, but each of the band members dressed up as a character from Donnie Darko. So you had Rick as Donnie Darko, Trevor was Frank the Rabbit from the movie, Peter was the Orb, and then Ben and Jeff were dressed as two of Donnie's friends from the Halloween party that's early on in the movie. So one was a Viking and the other one was Hulk Hogan. So pretty funny. And I went back and listened to that show, and it's a pretty fun show. So definitely check that out too. Another big time drive-in COVID event.
Yeah, absolutely. I love so much of the pop culture references that this band makes and gets into. Donnie Darko was a big deal, obviously, when I was in high school, and I'm still chasing their cover of the song from that movie, Echo and the Bunnyman, "Killing Moon." They do that one not super often, but definitely am dying to catch that. And then also kind of pioneering more stuff here at the end of COVID. Their Goose that year is literally on top of the Rockefeller Center building in New York. And if you get a chance, I can't highly recommend it enough. The set is amazing, but also, like, if you can just picture filming a band at night in the middle of the heart of Manhattan on top of one of the most famous buildings rooftops, it's striking visually. And that, I think I said in the first episode, that's how I got introduced to Goose. So even though it was socially distanced and there wasn't a crowd there, can't recommend that Goose Miss enough.
No, it was awesome. And it was a big deal at the time. Still, with there being a lot of live streaming when it comes to band gigging and stuff like that. The numbers that you find online about this thing are crazy. 60,000 viewers. They raised over $45,000 for charity for this event. And it's a fun one to listen back to, but I will say, as someone who has done this, it's not an easy one to listen to when you're driving in your car because you can hear all the taxis and stuff honking in the background, and it's a little jarring.
Okay, yeah, maybe not in the car, but if you get a chance, especially if you can watch the videos, if you can find those on YouTube, I think all of them are on YouTube. But yeah, if you could watch it maybe at home.
You can listen in the car, but just make sure that if you hear a honk, you're not flicking off the guy behind you, as I will plead the fifth on. I may or may not have done that before.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So you want to move on to 2021 at this point?
Yeah, 2021. This is really where we're getting into the meat and potatoes here.
Yeah, this is a lot more where we didn't have to do quite as much digging. Mostly from this point forward, you've kind of got all the information that you could want about Goose. Everything's kind of a well oiled machine by this point, or at least getting there. So 2021, just some of the highlights. First head tapes, February of 2021. Also in February, collab with Vampire Weekend on the song 2021, which I can only imagine how much that meant to the band because I know they're heroes of Peters, and Rick is a very big fan of the indie scene as well. And then Shenanigans Nightclub comes out in June of 2021. So, I mean, even just the first half of this year is ridiculously productive and busy.
Yeah, that Vampire Weekend collab was huge exposure for these guys. It was a cool project that Ezra from Vampire Weekend asked them to do, and they made a 20-minute and 21-second version of 2021 and released it. And they didn't play it for a while on the tour circuit, but it was really well received, and it's really cool to listen back to and think about how these musicians were collaborating at that time when they couldn't be touring as much.
Absolutely, and kind of laying the groundwork work for their collaboration this year at the Cap Theater. So
Yeah.
definitely a good relationship for them moving forward. And of course, we also have the Fred the Festival. Fred the Festival was a humongous deal in 2021. They're starting to work on Dripfield in the spring, and there's also the Vasuto reunion to talk about in November 2021. This is just kind of a random personal note, but all three drives played in order, first time ever.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Uh, let's backtrack a little bit to taking it back to the Shenanigans nightclub here. That was officially put out early on in the year in 2021, and it's been remarked on in many interviews by the guys as kind of a difficult album to release. I have to imagine COVID was a big driver of that, along with trying to record between touring and not being able to necessarily afford all the studio time you'd want as a smaller band. They had a big catalog to pull from of songs that they could put on this album at the time, and I'm sure trying to create a aesthetic or a sound that defines this album must have been tough, but still a really great effort by these guys. You can really hear them starting to define their sound in the studio and how they were trying to differentiate their jams and their jammy band side of their vibe from more of their indie studio side, which is awesome. And worth noting on this last point was the album also had a film, which people love or hate. It's kind of got a cult following amongst the fan base. It's got the band members and a lot of their family and close friends in it, and it's pretty tough to find out there, but you can find it online still. And it was directed and filmed by former Moon Cabin collaborator Will Thresher, who worked on some of the artwork and stuff for Moon Cabin for them back in 2016.
Yeah, absolutely. The Shenanigans, I do think it's interesting that they were him and Rick, Peter and Rick rather, were both saying that they wanted to kind of establish new identities for the songs outside of what they do in the live setting jam wise. And it's interesting that Shenanigans comes out and obviously it wasn't as fulfilling of a process as they were hoping for due to kind of recording it piecemeal, a little bit at a time, not affording studio, but also they didn't really, according to them, accomplish their goal of kind of reimagining these songs. And I think it's so fascinating that while being in the process of getting ready to release this album that's ultimately, according to them, been unfulfilling, they're also already starting to work on Dripfield with the new producer, James Goodwin. And of course, we'll get into this more later on down the road, but that ended up being fulfilling for them as far as kind of reimagining what the songs could be from a live setting to a studio setting. So I think it's interesting that both those significant pieces on two different albums are kind of starting and ending in the same year.
You have to imagine after the success they had found going through COVID and being one of the most popular online acts at the time, just putting out content for jam band fans all over the place to listen to, that they could get more funds and studio time for Dripfield that wasn't there from these initial recordings of Shenanigans. That who knows how far back this thing was starting to be recorded, with Moon Cabin being so long prior to that.
Totally agree. Absolutely.
And going into that summer of 2021, their normal touring season, everyone was starting to get more comfortable with going out on tour and stuff. So you started to see them play things like Sohani Music Festival, and that's still pretty socially distanced. And eventually, kind of July timeframe, things started to feel a lot more back to normal. And they played two big shows at Sculpture Park in Denver, 2 nights, and estimated crowds of over 5,000 people at the time, which is pretty crazy for a smaller band at the time to get that kind of audience. And there's reports of people standing outside the park listening in, even that couldn't get in. That they had such a interest in that was being piqued by people all over the place that they wanted to see this band.
Yeah, it's really crazy because you started to see like the growth in the size of the shows and whatnot in 2019, but to have, you're starting to build in 2019 and then 2020 happens. And when you get to 2021, you're not resetting or starting over with any momentum lost from COVID. You're in fact just still trending up to the sky. It's like we talked about. They really did such a better job than almost anyone in 2020. And that's why they're able to just keep reaching these dizzying highs where I feel like a lot of bands at this time were kind of just like, okay, how do we get our feet back centered under us? And Goose didn't really need to do that. Just very impressive stuff.
Yeah, and their success, you had mentioned it earlier, led to Lock-In Festival was struggling at the time with all the COVID shutdowns and everything, that they started doing individual band festivals, and that's where Fred the Festival came in to make use of those lock-in farm grounds in Arlington, Virginia that are very famous from that festival. And it was still like a socially distanced ish kind of event. Killer lineup on that. You had Goose playing 4 sets. You had people like Dawes and Corey Wong and Dr. Dog there. And it was the first official live performance of the acoustic trio, they called themselves at the time. If you look at the festival billing, now known as Arabelo. And it looked like a great time. There's a Fred the Festival, the movie that they put out, I believe, or the film maybe, that they put out online that you can watch, and you can get an idea of some of the songs they played at the festival. And then there's clips thrown in of like all the fun shenanigans they would do at the festival. Like they'd have games for the attendees, and everyone was on a different team that was headed by one of the band members and playing games like camp games like tug of war and stuff, I have to imagine. And it looked like a great time and a great success. A lot of those gigs weren't necessarily a success, I have to imagine, for Lock-In, but this one looked like it was pretty packed. And the reunion of Basuto was huge. We can dive into that a little bit if you want. That's awesome for anyone who's there.
Yeah, that festival, I mean, it kind of affects every part of Goose. It's a big impact. I still love listening to those sets. I think I was listening to them about a week ago, honestly. But those shows are really, really good. You've got a couple songs, on each set that don't really get played super often, some deep tracks. And then, Vasudo was together for like a year or two tops, and you don't hear anything about it. And then just kind of out of nowhere, Vasudo's at this festival too, playing live for the first time in forever. So I really wish, I think if I could go back in time to anything Goose related, it might be to go to either, if it's not Peach Fest 2019, it might be this Fred the Festival, because I can't imagine, too many other instances that were more significant for the band. And I'm sure they had to be feeling, this is so Goose centric and so much Goose love in the air, or it had to feel that way anyways, that if you're a big Goose fan, I think, this is the kind of thing that you would want to have the opportunity to be at.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was an insight for a lot of people who maybe weren't as familiar with Matt Campbell at the time. He's still a big part of Goose, even with Vasudo disbanding, just helping with the songwriting process with Rick, and they're still close. And I can't imagine how tough it was during COVID times for a musician like Matt. I'm sure that having a gig for Vasudo was throwing him a bone, and they released an album and everything, and played a few more gigs through the years with Vasudo, and brought in Peter on that to accompany them. And just awesome. There's a killer version of Factory Fiction where they brought Matt back to sing and play the keys on, and I listen to that all the time.
What a moment that's got to have been for Matt Campbell, and to have written so many of the songs that have gone on to become iconic Goose classics, and then come back full circle and get to have this moment. It had to feel so rewarding and so amazing. And what's cool about the Vasudo set from that show in particular is that while a lot of the songs are from Goose's catalog, when you're listening to Vasudo, it is distinctly a different vibe. It's a little bit more reggae beachy feel to it. So it's really fun as you get more and more into Goose to hear the same songs, but from a not completely different perspective, but at least a little bit of a different perspective. It is a very interesting set, and very happy that they got back together for that. It's really, really cool stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And shout out to the other official Goose tune that came from that show, the debut of Rockdale, which is a banger and in contention for Jam of the Year this year from the most recent show from the summer tour, which is pretty wild.
Yeah, I'm absolutely positive that Rockdale will come up in a future episode for us. So I'll table that for right now, though.
Well, continuing off of that momentum from Fred the Festival, they played a awesome Halloween show. They didn't call it the Netflix and Chill, which is unfortunate. I kind of like that name. I'm partial to the puns. But they played another Austin Powers themed show, this time Spy Who Shagged Me, so the sequel. The band played in costume again, which is awesome. I want to see a Halloween show with these guys eventually. That seems like so much fun. And then the band continued on through their fall tour. They had an official release of night one from their 2-night stand in Denver, Colorado at the Mission Ballroom. That's a great listen. And they just continued their momentum all the way into Goosemas, which was supposed to be played in December of that year, but one of the band members got COVID, which is a shame. And they had to postpone it all the way to February of 2022 during a very busy early year gigging time for them.
And I believe that was the show that got canceled was going to be their first arena show, correct?
Yeah, that was going to be the biggest show that they've ever done at the time, and an arena show at Mohegan Sun is a big deal.
Very, very cool, but very, very also unfortunate that they couldn't do it when they planned on. But anyone that remembers the COVID times, remember that was a wacky time to be alive for sure.
Yeah, just having to be flexible with knowing that your show that you have in a week might be canceled at any time. And luckily, bands were very gracious during this time, including Goose.
Totally agree.
So that's a good segue into early 2022 when that Goosemas show was played. Do you have any thoughts on that show?
Yeah, it definitely lived up to the moment. Obviously, the band was rising up for that occasion, and I definitely think they rise to meet the moment. 2022 is well, we're going to get into it more and more, but 2022 may be the single biggest level up year for them from my perspective. Obviously, we talked a lot about the previous years building and building and building, but this year is just, I mean, Mohegan is amazing. I listen to that one fairly often, I would say. But you've got Dripfield coming out, Radio City. There's so much here.
Yeah, and they really started it all the momentum that year with that Goosemas makeup show. And they debuted some of their new tracks from Dripfield that night with Hunger Sight and Dripfield proper. And that was in the middle of what they had as already a pretty intense touring schedule early on in the year, going through early March. To play a 3-set Goosemas show and debut 2 songs and play some of the great versions of these songs during that is pretty great. They capped off that early touring season of that year with another official release of theirs from Philadelphia on March 12th of 2022, which is my personal favorite of the official live releases pre-2024, I'll say. I mean, it's my new hometown of Philadelphia. Being an originally Atlanta guy moving up here, that gives me some pride, being in South Jersey and Philly being my closest city. But it's got some killer versions of songs like All I Need and Redbird and Factory Fiction that are like the preeminent peak versions of these songs for a lot of folks still. Definitely worth checking that one out. And the lead up into Dripfield, like you mentioned, was crazy. Just so many big shows. They played Bonnaroo. They released Dripfield in that summer. And then they play what might be their biggest level up gig, like you mentioned, at Radio City Music Hall, the first night of that 2-night run being the day that Dripfield released.
Yeah, it's just you kind of your jaw hits the floor. At least it does for me when you're looking at all of this in a row. Like Dripfield is obviously their greatest achievement in the studio, other than the recently released EP Autumn Crossing, which is not really an album, but Dripfield is an incredible album. And then to be on top of that, also hitting Radio City, also hitting Red Rocks for the first time, fall tour with Trey. I mean, and that there's still more. Tonight Show debut. It's just I struggle going back to really put in perspective how much they got done in such a short amount of time.
The promotion around Dripfield was fantastic to be able to line up these big monumental gigs with the album release and promote it so well. So, like we mentioned, their biggest gig up to date aligned with the album release of the peak of their studio work, working with James Goodwin on this album, who had worked with Bob Weir previously and other big indie acts like The National, is awesome. And their newest material is some of the best stuff that they've put out, which has to give fans a lot of hope at the time. And then, not to mention, you had talked about differentiating themselves from the studio and live. Like, you hear a track like The Whales or Arrow on this, and it sounds way different from what you hear when you go to a show, and not in a bad way. So it's a little bit jarring if you listen to those tracks from the live setting and then go to the studio, but there's a lot to love here. And then to line that release of something they're so proud of with Radio City, like, wow, mind blowing.
Yeah, normally you'd almost think you need the drip field to even set up the Radio City. So the fact that like drip field doesn't even need to be out yet for you to, check off such a major milestone in an artist's career, it's just crazy. Like they had two studio works essentially at this point, whether you want to call them albums or what. We can split hairs on Moon Cabin or Shenanigans or whatever you want, but like it's two studio projects and they're lining up all of this just ridiculously large scale touring. So I mean, it's just one of the more impressive years that I've seen from a band. With all the milestones they're able to check off all at the same time. And Dripfield is an album that even if you're like a diehard jam band that only really cares for live cuts, I mean, that album is listenable completely from start to finish. There's no bad songs on it. And they truly accomplished their goal of reimagining these things. Like you said, they felt like they kind of failed on that for Shenanigans, but Dripfield, it's fully realized. I mean, these are new versions of these songs.
And they wanted to make that known at that release show, so they played a 3-set show that night. The first set of both shows that weekend, I believe it was a weekend show, was all acoustic. And then they got into the meat and potatoes of it all. And set 3 that first night, they brought in a horn section to play like all the licks that you hear on the album from Arrow and Hot Tea, and brought in James Goodwin to play some guitar too, which is pretty awesome. But the real highlight of this weekend was night 2, where the level up from the jam band scene's perspective was fully realized.
Yeah, kind of like the metaphorical passing of the torch, as they say. Because when Trey joins them at Radio City, I mean, it's pretty much dominated the jam world after that. And that may be as far as Goose shows that I've watched, that's probably easily the one I've watched the most is Radio City. And it's so freaking cool when Trey does come out. One, the audience's reaction to it. It's just absolutely awesome to see. But then also like recognizing that like for Peter and Rick especially, like this guy is their hero. They've been watching him since they were preteen teenagers. So I can't imagine what was going through their minds or exactly how much it must have meant for them to, I mean, it had to feel at least to a certain degree, look, we've made it.
Yeah. For those not familiar, Trey is Trey Anastasio from Fish, and I'm sure everyone listening to this is familiar, but just wanted to shout that out just in case for any newbies to the scene, maybe. Kind of a huge deal. He's really inherited the mantle from the Dead days, as many say, and just a killer guitarist. And for him to join the band for almost the entire second set of their biggest shows to date and the encore is pretty crazy. He sang a little bit on Arcadia that night. They played a killer jam on Hunger Site. There's a lot to love here. And that's not to overshadow the guests they pulled in from the first set. They even got Father John Misty, huge on the indie scene, to play a little bit with them earlier in the show. And then eventually both Trey and Father John Misty joined them for the encore to play some Tomorrow Never Knows by the Beatles, which is just outstanding. Just killer stuff on this release. Definitely listen to this. This is priority number 1 as far as I'm concerned for anyone who is trying to get into their live stuff and understand how big this band's gotten and why they've hit this trajectory.
Yeah, it is the live release for me, anyways. I think it is for a lot of people, a lot of us, especially if you do have familiarity at all with Trey. Like, I don't want to go off on a Trey rabbit hole here because that could take for absolutely ever. But it's also very cool when you watch him on stage with them, how he's kind of deferring to Rick and Peter at almost all times. He's not making any effort to take over or make this his show. And he totally could because he's, maybe the best guitarist on the planet, but he lets it be their moment. And to your point too, the Father John Misty cameos are amazing as well. Like, I mean, he makes a big impact on the sets. So it's a priceless show. It's a humongous moment for them. It's a huge achievement for them. And I know it meant the world to them. So definitely agree. Must see appointment viewing.
Yeah, and that guest spot led to the eventual fall tour, dubbed by fans as the Taboose tour or Trey Goose or whatever you want to call it, where Trey Anastasio Band and Goose co-headlined a series of shows going through November, and man, were those cool shows where both bands were guesting with each other a lot. There's a lot of great stuff to listen to. They would usually at least play a song or two together at some point during those shows, and it's so much fun. And I really remember all the marketing and stuff around that being really fun and very widespread. People who weren't even that familiar with either of the bands was talking about it at the time, and man, I wish I could have gone. I had tickets for one of the shows in PA and I just couldn't go. And it looks like a killer time. Every one of those set lists or the guest spots or whatever gives you a moment that you can walk away from a show from be thinking, "Wow, that was special."
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure it meant a lot too in terms of like mentorship. I know Rick mentioned in a couple of the articles how Trey kind of made an effort to let them know he was taking them under his wing to a certain extent. And one of the funnier quotes out of all of that was, I guess at one point during one of the shows, Rick was telling Trey that they like to kind of ease into it. And Trey was basically just like, "Oh, I never do that." And Rick said it had such an impact on him so that now they try and start off high energy right from the beginning, because why wouldn't you? So I'm sure it meant the world to them. And I'm sure there's lots of lessons that are not quoted in articles by Rick that they learned, but it had to have been just a formative experience for the band and just kind of getting a little bit more sense of what they may want to do and how they might want to handle their new success. So that tour is epic.
Oh yeah. And like I said, nothing bad to listen to from that tour. Definitely check out those sets, both the Tab and Goose sets, because you'll get a little bit of Goose in both. Obviously, a lot of Goose in the Goose sets, but you'll get Trey on songs on the Goose sets. You'll get Peter or Rick or whoever on songs from Tab. So definitely awesome time to check out this band. And once that tour ended, they still had a lot to say to finish out the year doing their own headlining gigs solo, going into their first Goose Miss away from home. So they played Goose Miss outside of Connecticut for the first time in Broomfield, Colorado, and played 2 nights at the First Bank Center, one of which was eventually released December 16th, 2022. Another awesome show. And then they wrapped up the year with a New Year's show in Cincinnati, going back to their roots with that Northern Kentucky, Cincinnati greater area that they had built quite a following with in their early days to get their first 2 night stands and residencies and stuff like that. They give them a treat with a New Year's headlining gig, and that's another killer release. I always think of that artwork from that release and be like, that's like the most tattoo worthy stuff they've released on an album cover. It looks great, sounds great. Just crazy to get 2 releases within 2 weeks of each other.
Yeah, totally. And those shows are probably up there for most I've ever listened to, other than Radio City, because I listen to that Goosemas and that Cincinnati show all the time. I mean, they are flawless, and this is starting to get into the area where, continuing off of the Taboos tour or Trey Goose, whatever one you want to use, there's just no missed shows till the end of the year, pretty much. I mean, this is starting to get to the period where I'm just like, there aren't really any bad Goose shows anymore. Like fall 22 and on, you're kind of just looking at, there may be some rare outliers, but for the most part, this is just all constant gold. And the Goosemas and New Year's are, I mean, to have that in the same year as Radio City, I mean, those are three of maybe my top 5 to 10 shows. So finishing with a bang.
Yeah, 2022, like you said, was just such a huge year. So much gold coming out of these different tours and all the experience they were getting from the guest spots and stuff like that. It's really peak Goose time, especially for their more modern sound.
Yeah, and they also did, just a random side note, I'm not going to talk about it too much, but they also did their first Tonight Show, that December. So pretty much everything under the sun was happening for Goose in 2022.
Yeah. Yeah, to be able to play Dripfield on national TV. Pretty crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think as we move into 2023, starting to become not even really history anymore, we're like almost in the present. We've got Hunger Site played during the Super Bowl broadcast. Obviously, Goose is really starting to hit the mainstream at this point.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, and shout out to WTED Radio, who has an awesome clip hyping up that moment at the Super Bowl where you can hear Hunger Site being played as they break for commercial during probably one of the peak intense points in the game. So really cool if you're a Goose fan to be able to hear that and be like, oh my God, I know those guys. And they're on the biggest broadcast in the world, and their music's being exposed to people who might be like, that's really catchy. What is that? So small little shout out to maybe a few seconds of a huge deal broadcast.
Hey, airtime during the Super Bowl is about as expensive as it gets. So it's pretty wild that they were played during that. It's pretty outstanding stuff.
Yeah.
And then we've got a lot just I mean, maybe not as insane as 2022 is, but still tons happening in 2023. They've got 5 shows in the spring at the Capitol Theater. They've got Live at the Salt Shed, which I mean, some of the versions of songs from that show are just absolutely out of this world. SPAC 23 is their largest show to date, and then the biggest Goose Miss ever as well at the end of the year.
Yeah, and another thing I totally forgot to bring up before, they did Playing in the Sand again to start the year, and they were much more well known then to where they could have Bob Weir guesting with them on songs and stuff like that. So they had really just blown up. And don't want to dive too deep into any of these shows, just noting that they're playing 5 night stands at the Cap, which is crazy that their ties to Shapiro just blew up and they could play 5 nights at a historic venue like that. Live at the Salt Shed, we keep saying this is our favorite release and stuff like that. Another killer release. They really don't miss, in my opinion, when it comes to what shows they pick to be official releases on all the major platforms. Obviously, being spoiled with Nugs, you can get a lot any show you want, basically from the recent years, but to have these official releases that are more mastered and clean and just super well produced is great.
Yeah, I mean, it probably goes without saying, but we are, to be fair, a little bit biased. I think, my lowest rated Goose show is still good. So it's just like for me, it's good to great. So when I'm ranking these, it's like, it's next to impossible because it's like, well, the floor is good. So now it's just a matter of did it blow me out of the universe? So
Maybe we're not jaded enough yet.
that could be maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. They just when they go in and release whoever's picking these tracks, maybe it's still Peter, I don't know. But whoever's selecting these releases for live releases is just they're on it.
Yeah. And you mentioned SPAC. What a crazy, huge historical venue played by greats like Fish and Dave Matthews Band and other huge acts. You get the biggest acts of the summer going to SPAC. So crazy venue. Great to see them have their debut there with a killer set list that's well regarded by the fan base. A definite highlight on Nugs. We're going to bring that up a ton as the show continues, I imagine, in future episodes and stuff like that. And really, I mean, they're playing it again this year, so and playing 2 nights this time. So it really must have been a huge success at the time, and it's one I've listened to maybe the most from 2023.
Yeah, two huge historic venues in terms of like what they mean to the jam band world. I mean, you've got SPAC in the summer, and then when you get to Goose Miss, they're doing it at Hampton Coliseum, which anyone that has been in the jam band scene for a while, the significance of that arena. So we keep saying it, almost just becomes like just different versions of repeating ourselves, but they just kept leveling up and kept leveling up, and every year shows further production. But to put myself in their shoes, it must have been pretty wild to check off SPAC and Hampton Coliseum in the same year. I mean, that's the kind of stuff you dream of when you're starting out as a jam band.
And those Hampton shows were your first Goose shows, right? So I want to hear you talk about those because I wasn't there.
Yeah, so it took me way too long to finally get to a live show, but those were my first two times seeing Goose in person, and man, did it live up to the hype. I'm normally not a person that will, I guess, go into a show wanting a lot of covers, but when you're talking about the greatest cover band going right now, it has less of an impact than it would with other artists. And that Goose Miss was notable because they played a ridiculous amount of covers and a bunch of first time played. I mean, if you look at the show notes on El Goose, you see so many FTP, FTP, FTP. They were really pushing themselves out of their comfort zone with adding new comfort covers into the mix. And they also, talking about like your Netflix shows that you love so dearly or think are so amusing. There was a whole entire theme for this Goose Miss. So the Hampton Coliseum, the theme was Goose Miss in space. So before and after every set, there would be voiceovers recorded by the band that were kind of introducing us to new planets, and each set had a theme for that planet. So there was like a lava planet, and you're getting the Jimi Hendrix Fire cover, things like that. There was a bubble planet where we're getting like pancakes and themes like in a circle. So as far as like I didn't really know what to think going into seeing Goose, and they just completely blew my mind. It was more than I could have ever expected. And the fact that they were playing some of these songs for the very first time, you definitely wouldn't have known it. Everything was perfection.
Really fun listen. Shout out to the Justin Timberlake jam. I forget what night it's from, but the fact they can jam out a Justin Timberlake song, awesome. I love that. Again, it's not music I typically listen to, but when Goose does it, I'll give it a shot, and I love that. So definitely worth checking out. I think that you really can't miss here. And at the time, you look back on things like Reddit and the El Goose Facebook page and stuff like that, and there was all kinds of rumors swirling before Goose Miss about drummer Ben Atkin potentially leaving the band, and people being like, "No, that's all fake BS. Like, forget about it." And then seeing the petty people going back and being like, "Check the receipts, bro," when they wound up being right that Ben issued a statement that he was leaving the band officially. That must have been a really scary time for people who were planning on a lot of future shows and stuff like that. I know reading that statement, I didn't know where this band was going to go. It seemed like it could have been a death nail. And yeah, let's dive into that a little bit. How are you feeling about the departure of Ben and the statement put out and all of that?
Yeah, so I mean, it was kind of confusing because I was still, kind of getting my feet with Goose under me, and I didn't really know what to think about like Goose Reddit quite yet at that time. And you did see blurbs about it or little hints of rumors back as far as August of that year, but it didn't really seem like substantiated in any way. And then it was like probably a week after Goose Mist that the rumor boards started going pretty crazy and pretty consistently crazy. And I remember that me and a lot of my friends that have become fans, we were all kind of freaking out a little bit because you never know when someone's getting kicked out of a band or leaving a band. If you've been following music closely for long enough, it could be, like you said, the end of the band. So you don't really know how it's going to shake out. Is there a replacement that they have in mind that can do the same job? At the time, all I had heard about Ben was that he was a great guy and a great person. So, a little bit sad as well because I've seen nothing to contradict the fact that he is a good guy. So you feel bad on that part from the human side, but yeah, just a ton of uncertainty and just kind of really deep down hoping like that this isn't the end of what had at that point already become my favorite band. And I'll let you speak on that in a second, but just one thing before I forget. Also want to announce like we could not move past this Goosemas without also calling out that Bruce Hornsby joins them for the way it is on stage. And there had been rumors about that. They had been covering the way it is for a very long time, but he lives kind of in the area of Hampton Coliseum, and you had seen stuff online like maybe he will. But when he came out on night two, that absolutely was a humongous moment for the band. And you could tell Peter sharing the key space with him, it meant the world. So, and very cool to see as a fan, too.
Yeah, love Bruce Hornsby. Awesome to have him guesting with our favorite band. Great cover they do. Even better when Bruce is on it. So definitely shout out to that. Didn't mean to skip over that. It's just felt like the natural transition from the end of Goosemas into the big news of the departure of Ben.
Yeah, totally get it.
And that was kind of wild because the rumor mill was going nuts. You had people denying stuff that was said in the official statements by both the band and Ben. People thought there might be bad blood, but the statements read like it was just creative differences and there was a mutual respect there still. So it's hard to know what exactly happened, but I'm going to just lean on the official statement by the guys and Ben himself and hope that things are still okay between them and it was just creative differences and wanting to try something new.
Yeah, I think everything we've seen since then kind of indicates that it was just creative differences. So, you'll never know the full story. None of us will, I don't think, but you just hope that it works out for the best. Ben's been able to pick back up with Elephant Proof, which I hope ends up being fruitful for him. And, I think Goose is in a better place than they've ever been, which as we've seen going through these years, it seems like the next year, Goose is always better than they were the year before. So just hoping that keeps continuing.
Yeah, and that leads us into 2024 when there was so much uncertainty about who was going to replace Ben at drums. And the band officially makes an announcement that they've picked Cotter Ellis to join the band, who was well known in local circles and things like that, playing a ton of Dead covers and stuff like that on the scene. And man, they announced him with a bang because they announced a 4-show run at the Capitol Theater with Cotter, and no one knew what that was going to be like. But man, was that a barn burner. killer shows, some of the best versions you'll hear of some of these songs over those 4 nights. And Cotter just picked things up like he had been with the band for years.
Absolutely. And I will throw out before the cap run, we also had the Chateau sessions that were released online, which was kind of like the band's, I guess, we're told after the fact, these were like the first jam sessions that they had or tryouts with Cotter that ended up later becoming like officially his first jam sessions with the band. And I would say that anxiety in the Goose community was still relatively high until we saw those Chateau sessions released on YouTube. That calmed me down a little bit. I think it calmed my friends that are fans down a little bit. That was a little bit, just okay. We needed that. We're back at ease. This Cutter guy seems like the real deal, and he vibes well with this band, and we can tell this is going to open up the music. And then you get to the cap run, which those were also streamed. Thank you, Goose. You're the best to your fans. You give us all these live streams. Um, the cap runs were just mind blowing, and there some of the jams and songs from that run are still sitting very highly on my best of 2024. So they hit it out of the park. I still have no idea how much of a madman Cotter is to learn that entire catalog in like 2 months of relentless practice and then just be like close to perfect in his first run with the band and just unbelievable run. I mean, they did it. One of the shows was on the eclipse day, and we did all of Moon Cabin the whole night in its entirety, collabing with Vampire Weekend on night 4. There's just so much great stuff to call out from that run, but it's really standing tall even as we're getting far into 2024.
Yeah, and if anyone had any doubts up to this point, between the Chateau sessions, funny story is I was listening to that in the background and not really watching, and I wasn't even aware at one point that it wasn't Ben playing on some of these songs because it just sounded so natural. I was like, "Are we sure this is a new drummer? Like, maybe I misread this that they're playing with Cotter." And then I went back and watched the videos, like, oh yeah, sure enough. So really great stuff. The cap run, you felt like maybe the Chateau session stuff was like the best of or something, and the cap run is really what put me at ease. And just some of the going back to our episode 1, some of those live cuts I talk about being good for new Goose fans, some of their best versions are from the cap run. Not to mention the guest spots with Vampire Weekend. Wow. Just to be able to jam out some of their songs for 30 minutes and stuff like that is pretty crazy. The full playing of Moon Cabin you mentioned, that's probably my personal highlight. Just awesome to get all of the same album in the same show. And you just had some banner moments that you didn't think you'd see when you have a new member joining the band for their first real concerts. First song Cotter ever played on was Flow Down, which people have their feelings about, but I think that's a great way to introduce him personally, and the momentum never stopped from there.
No, it certainly didn't. I honestly don't think I would choose a different song than Flow Down. It's the kind of the perfect way to kind of throw him to the wolves, so to speak. But yeah, totally right. So many of those versions are standouts. The Drive, the Into the Mist, the Tumble, the Rosewood. There's a lot of gems on there. Highly encourage anyone that somehow hasn't found a way to get into those shows. Definitely take some time and get into them because it's some of the best stuff that they've done as a band. And to be doing that when Cotter is brand spanking new is just mind blowing.
Yeah, definitely. I don't want to dive in too much into the sets because we could be talking for hours here about that. You got like 12 hours of music to listen to if you want to listen to those albums, but I could talk for 36 hours about what I think about it. So we better move on or we'll be here all night.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, pretty much since then we've just had the high school Wilton shows where so many of the band members all went to high school at, and then when those shows were performed, they also released on YouTube again because they are so kind of their fans, the documentary about their experience all at the high school. And then we've had this summer tour where Goose played its 2 largest shows ever back to back. So we're kind of like to the present time now.
That summer tour, there isn't a bad show to listen to. I know we've said that about some of the past tours, like the Taboos and stuff, but really, once the summer tour started going, even if you had concerns about Cotter being added after the cap run somehow, those were quickly quelled. And there's so many highlights to talk about. We're gonna have in our next episode a discussion on the best moments of 2024 so far, as kind of a preview into the fall tour and everything like that. And there's so much to pick from. You really can't go wrong here. If you were lucky enough to get out to a show, just awesome. I personally was at that Philly show at the Man. Great showing by the band, great showing by the fans, 14,000 strong. To hear Peter say this is the biggest show we've ever played, and then for that to be beat just 24 hours later was a little bit deflating as a Philly native, but also awesome to hear from the band's perspective. To sell out Forest Hills like that, a historic venue like that, is great. And yeah, I've listened back to these shows a bunch. It's hard not to. So many highlights to pick from, and the fact that Cotter learned all these covers and has added so many new dynamics to a lot of these jams is just, there's just so much we can talk about here, and so much to chew off that we can do a full episode about it next week.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you said, we both went to a bunch of shows, have a bunch more coming up. So, we definitely want to get into 2024 so far. So, if you're listening and you're interested, please send us a message on any of our platforms and let us know what your highlights from 2024. And we'll try and get into some of them on the episode next week. But I can't wait to talk about all the great stuff that Goose has been putting out. And I hope this has been helpful to anyone that, wanted to fill in some of the gaps as they're starting out with Goose. Like we said, there was no way we could possibly cover it all, but we tried to hit the main things for you. And yeah, hope to hear from some of you for the episode next week so we can talk about your favorite picks along with ours.
Yeah, it's going to be an awesome time. And I just want to say thank you to you, Mike. I know it was hard for you to show up to today's episode after the big Florida State loss to my Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. Go Jackets. And there's a big congrats in order for you, too, as a Florida State fan. You're the first team in ACC history to be 17th ranked.
So yeah, anyone out there listening still at this point, my best friend purportedly here is a bit of a jerk, and I almost didn't show up to work today. So no, I'm just kidding. Alex has been great about. He's been a good sport, but my team's a little mad at his team right now.
That's the first mean thing I've said to you. I had to get my jab in. But uh, thank you all for listening so much. We had a great time today. I know it's a longer episode than we even anticipated here. We kind of flew through as much as we could. But thanks for listening. And Mike, send us out.
Yeah, be sure to follow us, like we said, on all the socials. But thank you so much for listening to So Ready Pod, and we can't wait for next week.
See ya.